Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Simon Chenery. First thing I'll say is I am not a professional archaeologist. I am a member of the Fieldworkers. I've been out and about with the Reek Valley group and the Melton group. The idea for me of using QGIS on the field working came about partly when my other half, Carolyn, wrote a document on using QGIS for CBA East Midlands Parish Boundaries Project. And by way of that, I'm actually now currently chairman of CBA East Midlands. My day job is actually an analytical geochemist at British Geological Survey, which means I analyze lots of rocks and waters and things, but I also analyze archaeological material, pottery, glass and things, and bones and things like that. I would also say I am not an expert on QGIS. It's something I have used a bit and have developed an interest of, particularly for the field working. Okay, so let's start the next slide. So what is QGIS? QGIS stands for the Quantum Geographical Information System. And why am I suggesting we use QGIS, not the other market leader, which is ArcGIS from Esri, which is something that we use at work quite a lot, because ArcGIS is incredibly expensive, thousands of pounds a copy. But QGIS is free and it has roughly an equal capability. The current version is 3.22, and I'm not going to try and pronounce that Polish name. Each version has a name of a city. I've crossed out the previous version literally in the time I've been rewriting this talk. The new version has come out, and essentially a new version comes out every 6 months or less. But as you upgrade, you'll find you can read in the old versions. It's not a problem in upgrading. So what is today's QGIS talk? Today will not be a how-to talk. Today will be hopefully what QGIS can do for field workers. What I'll show is only a tiny fraction of what QGIS can do, but I hope that I can show some of the main features I think the Leicestershire field workers will need to get going. And if at the end of today you think you want to seriously try it, I plan on organising some hands-on practical sessions in the new year. So what is a GIS? As I said, it's a geographical information system, and I was trying to think of a way of describing it, and so I've sort of come up with this sort of visual analogy. So think about it as a pile of map sheets or drawings or photos, all sitting on top of a light box, and you can easily move any sheet you want to look at to the top, and if you turn on the light box, you can see one layer through another. But before I get into it, there's some vocabulary, just a few words that I'll be using as I go along, and it's probably easier to describe them now. So one of them is a raster. A raster is an image made up of a series of dots or pixels, just like your camera picture. But as you zoom into it, if you go in too far, it gets grainy and you'll start to see the individual pixels. The other format is vector. That's an image that's recorded as a digital description, e.g. this text that you'll find in a Word document or whatever. But the key point is, as you zoom in, it stays sharp. So there are big advantages to vectors. Also, when you start to save them in files, the files tend to be much smaller if they're based on vectors. Some other words, a layer. And a layer might be a map, and that could be a vector map or a raster map, or it might be a group of objects, such a group of contour lines, or all the stints in the field that you've put in. A feature is an item or group of similar items, usually in a vector layer, but it might be a spot with finds attached, it might be a photo, it might be a contour line. And there are objects. An object's an individual item, usually again in a vector layer, and a group of objects might be a feature. Sometimes you'll find me or others will actually use feature and object interchangeably. Okay, so if we start up QGIS, oh, I probably should say I'm not doing this live. I have tried to do this live before, but sometimes it can, if you've got a big map, it can take a while for it to load. So I'm doing this as slides. So when you open up an empty QGIS, it looks like this, and it looks quite complicated, quite intimidating. You know, you've got a lot of buttons across the top. You've got a lot of drop-down menus. You've got some access to a filing system on the left. But hopefully, as you know, we start looking at layers, it'll look a little bit more friendly. The other thing is I'm basically going to show you layers today that should be open source. So they'll either be free to access on registration, or some of them you can just download them directly, or they'll hopefully be created from your own data and information. So let's start by looking at something we all grew up with. Well, any of us who are probably over the age of about 40 or 30. Here we got a typical Ordnance Survey 50K map of the UK. And actually, this is a raster image, you know, that a map is actually made up of if you could look at it small enough, a series of very small printed dots. If you want to get the Ordnance Survey digital information, there's the address down there. And literally, since I started putting this talk together, you don't need to even register to get access and download most of the OS stuff anymore. So if we took an old-fashioned 50K Ordnance Survey map into QGIS, it would look like this. And so hopefully it would look fairly familiar. This is actually one that I downloaded quite a long time ago. I talked about a pile of maps, and how do we know which map's on top? Well, if we look over here where I've circled in red, it says that it's the 50K raster, and you see it's ticked. So that's the active layer, and it's also at the top of our list on the left. Just to highlight the issue of rasters versus vectors. So this is part of that map zoomed in, and you'll see this is a bit around Hungerton. This is actually where the Reek Valley did their first field walking, oh God, nearly 2 years ago now because of COVID. So you'll see this area again in the future. And this is zoomed in. This is zoomed in on Rearsby. This is where I live. And as you can see, as you zoom in, you can start to see the text gets fuzzy. That's because it's essentially a series of dots, and you're just making those dots bigger. There are a number of different scales OS map available, and they're currently now grouped under the title of the Master Map series. And an old-fashioned 50K can still be downloaded, and it's called Strategy, but it does warn you on the website there haven't been any updates since 2016. The biggest scale, i.e. covering the biggest area with relatively low resolution, which I think is roughly equivalent to the old 250K maps, is called Miniscale. Essentially, you can download the whole of the UK in a number of different visualizations. Some of them look like road maps that you'd find in a road atlas. Some of them show topography and a number of different features. But if you start to zoom into them, you don't see a great deal of detail. The next level down is called the district level, the OS vector map. Excuse me for a moment. And the highest resolution, which seems to be equivalent to the old 10K maps, is called Open Map. And actually, very nicely, the Ordnance Survey have actually produced a little PDF presentation describing using and accessing their data, and the address is down there below. So let's start with an old-fashioned 10K map. And those of you who've used them it should look fairly familiar. This is again in raster form. And if we zoom in a bit, and again, we see this area around Hungerton. Unfortunately, to get all the features of the 10K map, it seems now you actually have to pay for them. They don't come as a free version. So this is an old 10K, an old GIS 10K that I've had for quite a long time. And if we look at the new one, you can see it looks a bit empty. If I zoom in a bit, exactly the same area. It's missing the field boundaries, which is a real shame, because obviously having the field boundaries for field walking is a big plus.
I can't get the sound on
this. Oh, somebody's got their microphone on. Okay, so now we'll look at vectors. Exactly the same area. It looks a little more blocky. This vector is held in a layer that's known as a shape file. And so if you download it, you'll find it has an extension .shp. What I want you to look at is that here on the left, there are lots of different items. So there's everything from roads, streams, rivers, railways, and they're all as individual items. And what that means is, if I go to the next bit, here, what I've done is I've actually only turned on the roads and the railways and the rivers, and we've lost these brown areas which are woodland. So what you can do using the vectors is you can change it so you only put on the information you need. And as you start to build things up, that can become quite helpful. Otherwise, the map becomes rather overcomplicated if you've got too much detail there. Okay, a little bit more vocabulary before we go on. GIS systems need what's called a coordinate reference system and a projection. So the coordinate system, you can think about as the X and the Y, if you think back to more graph-like things, or if you're using Ordnance Survey speak, your eastings and northings dimensions. The projection is slightly different. That is the shape of the world in a map. And again, those of us who did geography many years ago will have heard of Mercator projections. And it's the way of turning our 3D spherical Earth into a flat 2D map. The British National Grid System, if you are looking up what coordinate system to use in QGIS, the one you need is OSGB 1936, or as it's sometimes called now, EPSG 227700. Very not nice, convenient numbers, but you will need to know that. And of course, the British National Grid System is based on XY numbers that are distance from the Greenwich meridian, the 0 point. And it starts to get complicated when you add other things, because Google Earth uses something called WGS 84 as its coordinate reference system. And that's in degrees, minutes, and seconds based on an arc. More noise in the background, never mind. When you first start QGIS with a blank project, you will need to tell it, either you need to tell it what CRS you're going to use, or it will adopt it from the first layer that's imported. You can import things, like you can import the OS map using the British National Grid and something from Google Earth with different CRS systems, but you need to project one onto the other. So if you start with BNG, you need to reproject your Google. Otherwise, you'll find things don't align. And that's probably the most common issue people have when they start. They hadn't noticed that the different things they're bringing in are in different coordinate reference systems. Of course, you might have maps that aren't already in a GIS format. So what you can see here is a very old OS map that I actually got the image from the National Libraries of Scotland. So how do we get that in? Well, we can do what's called, we can align it into the system with something called georegistering. And to do that, we need to find a number of key points on this old map that you would find on a new map. So you actually usually road boundaries and road intersections like here and here are good reference points because they usually haven't moved. So again, actually, if you look carefully, you can see this is Hungerton. This is the area we've been looking at. So now we can start to use the fact that we can see one layer through another. If we do this, so what I've done is I've got the image, this old OS map image, and I've put over the top of it the new raster image. And so if we look here, we can see this at this right angle of the road junction. Up here, we can see, well, we're a little bit off here. And one of the things when you're doing the georegistering is actually ideally you take a number of points across your map over as wide an area as possible, and then QGIS will stretch the map or compress the map in different dimensions to get the best fit. The more points you put in, the more effort you put in, the more closely you'll find things will align. But of course, the other thing is that the older maps, particularly if you're talking pre-1930s, are not necessarily going to be as accurate as a modern map. Something else I'd like to highlight with vectors is you can change how they look. So what I've got here is that, and you can download this as well from OS, you can download contour lines as a separate package. But when you put the contour lines as they come from OS onto the map, they're not very clear. But each of these layers has a properties associated with it. So we can change the look and the feel of things. So what I've done is I've put a thicker black dotted line, what started out as a very thin grey brown line. So we can change the width, we can change the color, we can change the style of it, so we can show things up more easily if we need to. Something else that can be very useful, particularly if somebody else is going to look at your GIS system, is labeling and photos. So labeling is a simple part of the QGIS. You just pop on a little button and then hit your mouse on the spot, and you can put a little label. So, you know, like I've marked here, this is the field in Hungerton that we walked with the help from Richard and Peter. To the right, you can see a little mini photograph. And if you double click on that, this is some photographs I took while we were field walking. Now, this particular way of adding the photos is not in the base GIS as it comes when you download it, but it's actually one of thousands of plugins that have been written by QGIS super users. When I call them super users, these are people who've been using it for years and actually can dig down and actually program the software. But you'll find inevitably, if there's something you want to do, somebody has probably written a plugin or some instructions on how to do it for QGIS. And a quick Google search with QGIS plus whatever you want to do will usually pop up how to do it. Okay, finally, some field walking. Now, I'll start by saying is that there is more than one way to do this. Even myself, I find that I don't end up doing it exactly the same way every time. And this is just one way of doing it, and it works for me. But one of the reasons Peter said we would like to get a group of people together is to come up with probably a consistent way of doing things across Leicestershire. So if we look over on the left-hand side, what I've done, I've got a number of layers here. So the first one is just a boundary of where we walked. The second one is the stints, and that's as a group of objects making up that layer, whereas the boundary is just one layer and one object. Something I would just say that is worth knowing, it's very helpful if you have your boundary corners of your field walk reasonably accurately written down. It just tends to save you some time later. Okay, so if you look over here, what I've now done is I've turned on a layer of the Roman pot finds. And what we see is I've got a series of spots now. The different spots have different sizes and the proportional to the number of finds. You can also have it just tell you a number of the number of finds in that. And in this way, you can tie the data to the stints directly. You can either, I should say that again, either you can tie the data to the stints directly, or you can have another layer of points in the center of each of the stints, which is particularly useful if they're not all of an even size. And actually, so I find this an easier way of doing it. It also allows you, if you got random finds, Peter in particular has a habit of finishing his stint first and standing up the edge and finding something on the edge of the field. Yeah, made him smile. Okay, so in the last one, I actually had all of the different types, whether they were Roman pot, late med pot, on different layers. But you can tie all the data for a particular stint on one point. And so if we look up here, I could have done it this way and just turned individual flipped individually between the different types of finds. And of course, the other thing, as I said before, about properties is that you can change the size, the shape, the color. So if you don't like having circles, you could have stars of different sizes. You could have all of them the same size and different colors depending on the number of finds. Okay, now a little bit about getting the data into the QGIS. So what I've got here is an image of an Excel spreadsheet that Paul Dickinson from the Melton Group uses, where he's taken the old-fashioned paper printed version and put it in Excel. And Paul is really good. He always includes a little clip map of something he's drawn out, a little map of where it is, and so on, and sometimes even a clip from Google. So that's usually one page of his spreadsheet, and then the second one looks hopefully very much like you would see on the old-fashioned paper ones. And so we got the number of finds. So we've got traverses along here. We got stints down the side and the number of objects. Unfortunately, this is quite an inconvenient way of getting it into the GIS. So what I normally do is I sort of then take Paul's spreadsheet and sort of turn it on its head a bit. And because QGIS wants an Excel or a CSV file, but ordered by rows of coordinates of the center of the stint with columns of finds. And that's when I wrote this down, I thought, you're never going to understand what I mean. So it's easier if I show you. So this one here, you can see we've got the find types in different columns. We got a stint number here, and we've got a traverse number here. And then now I've also added is an X and Y coordinates. So these are the British National Grid coordinates at the center of each traverse and stint. And this is much easier for QGIS to read in. The other thing you'll notice, I put zeros in here. One thing I've noticed people had tendency to do is not put zeros in if there are no finds, or also have nothing there if you haven't walked that stint. If we're going to have county-wide GIS systems, it's going to be quite important that we know whether people really have found nothing there or they haven't walked it, because it could be that you don't complete a field on one session, and it's not till another season goes by before you finish rewalking or finish walking that field, or in fact even if you rewalk it. So it is good if you actually have the difference between no finds and not having looked at that particular stint and traverse. This is my format. It's still up for discussion as to a formal format that would we'd like to roll out across the county, and that's something to be discussed. As I said at the beginning, I actually work for British Geological Survey, so I couldn't not have a QGIS without a geology layer. And geology might help you distinguish between natural material and man-made artifacts. I haven't included the link here, but you can download geology layers from the BGS website. But this also gives me a chance to show something else, that in a lot of layers that you will acquire, they have other information in the background associated with them. And if you use the information button on QGIS and spot on an individual object, it will then come up with the data behind that, and you can look at that. So in this case, it meant that I could look at what type of material was in the field we were looking at. And so if I look up here, it says diamicton, which is a clay type material left by glacial retreat. But you can also see that it doesn't actually cover all of our area, but we see something else down here. So it may be that it can help you interpret what's going on in the field. Okay, the bit that most people like is the LiDAR. Excuse me while I have a slurp of my coffee. You'll hear the term LiDAR a lot. It just means light detection and ranging, which isn't terribly helpful. It's a way of seeing the topography. There are a number of sources of this data. The only publicly available one, as far as I know, is from the Environment Agency. One thing to be aware is it doesn't have complete coverage. Largely it's intended for flood protection. So what the Environment Agency did when they flew the planes to take the LiDAR, they just flew the areas initially that were subject to flooding, and they're gradually filling it in. The other thing is that when they started doing this, probably more than 10 years ago, the technology wasn't as good, and the resolution was about 2 meters per spot, but the latest is now down to 0.5 meter resolution. So what we got here is the vector map for the Reek Valley, and so Rearsby's down here and Melton's up here. And I've left on the roads and the rivers and the railway and some names of places to help me find my way around. If you want to access the LiDAR data, I've put the link up the top here. Again, it's another one that's freely accessible. You don't need to register anymore. It is very large files. So you would normally download what they call a tile, SK, and the SK is from the SK area in the British National Grid system is our local tile. And if I remember rightly off the top of my head, that might be a couple of gigabytes. It can take a long time if you've got a slow connection. The important thing here is that you want the zip to include the shape files, and that's the vector data that you need to import directly into QGIS. Okay, so this now has the LiDAR data as you download it from Environment Agency or the Government Gateway for Environment Agency. The darker areas are the higher elevation, the lighter areas are the lower elevation. If you look at the properties for this, you can get what's called a histogram, which is gives you the number of points that are for any particular height value. And you can use this to set a minimum and maximum, because it may be the area you want to look at actually has quite a narrow range of heights, and it will by default display the full range, and you can change the minimum and max to get better contrast. But it still isn't great. It doesn't look that helpful. But this is where you use QGIS. So you can false color that data, and you can change from the boring grays to something much more colorful. I think this one's called spectrum. So it's much easier to see the highest points and the lowest points. It's also a lot prettier. And some people find this a bit harsh. You can change the color scheme. You can happily spend an hour just playing with the color schemes. But if we zoom in a bit, let's try and actually use it for something useful. So this is a field that Richard Knox did, and again, it's bigger spots for more finds. But what we can see is that the finds tend to be in the higher area here. This is up towards the A606, whereas as you go down to the river, the finds are getting less. But it's still not great. You know, you'd like to see some features. So a way to see features in more detail is to do something called Hillshade. And this is something you do in QGIS. This is QGIS processing the LiDAR data. And Hillshade is a false 3D effect made by illuminating the contours with an artificial sun from a particular direction or angle. And you can change that angle of the sun to highlight features better, in the same way that if you went out to the field and you looked early in the morning, the low angle light might highlight some features, but not others very well. And you go back in the evening, more towards sunset, and you'll see a whole different set of features as the light is illuminating things from a different angle. So this is actually a bit further up the Reek towards, or down the Reek, should I say, towards, this is the Brooksby gravel extraction down here. And what I'd like you to look at is up here, is that you can actually see the original meanders of the river that were straightened in the 19th century by canalization. In this one, the artificial sun is coming from the northwest. So you can see it's highlighting this ridge as you come up from the river. And if you look on this side over here in this big hole dug at the Rearsby Quarry, this side is in shadow because of the direction of the illumination. And if we zoom in a bit more and move up here, what we can see here, we can see the old ridge and furrow. And interestingly, it's cut off by the railway. But it does look as though we can actually see older field boundaries hidden. The modern field boundary is here, but to my eye, this is probably a continuation, and the actual ridge and furrow has either been ploughed out, or when they built the railway, has rather lost that original feature. This is from another site. This is from one of Paul's over in the Melton direction. So this is where we're now putting the hillshade and the fines together. One thing I would say is that once you've done the hillshade in QGIS, it won't automatically save it, but you can save that layer. So later on, you don't have to go through the process of processing the data again. You can just bring in that layer. A lot of people like to see it laid over Google. Obviously, Google Earth you can see things for real. You can go back in time on Google. One thing I do have to say, Google Earth is not officially supported in QGIS anymore, or vice versa. If you look on the internet, they'll tell you a number of ways that you can access the Google data. Its legality, inverted commas, is dubious. If Google really didn't want you to have access, they'd have found a way of shuttering it off, but they don't make it easy. But as I understand it, that it might be possible that we can get official access as a community organization, and I'm looking into that at the moment. Sometimes you might want to build up multiple layers. So I talked about looking at a map through a light box. Well, the way you do that in QGIS is you change the opacity, you change the amount of see-through in different layers. So here we've got the fines on the top. I've changed the Google layer so that it's only partly opaque, and underneath is the OS map, so we can see the line of the road here. Taking it one step further, here I'm combining the hillshade, the Google satellite data, and the field walking data, and the OS data. And actually, I find the combination of the Google, I shouldn't call it Google, because you can get there's Bing Maps, and there are other sorts of satellite data, but combining satellite data and hillshade, I think, could be a very good way of identifying old versus new field boundaries, and potentially crop marks, etc. I mean, particularly, perhaps an example, I haven't found one yet, but maybe you have a crop mark you think is a barrow, and the barrow might have a elevated center and a bit of a shade of ditch around it, and then that would show up in the hillshade, and the crop mark associated with it would show up in the satellite data. Just 3 words. There has been some discussion about using just 3 words for locating objects. It's actually something that Paul from Melton is very keen on. Just 3 words works on your phone. It's another coordinate system, if you like. It uses 3 unique words to give you a 3 meter square anywhere in the world. And there is a QGIS plugin for this, and it works quite nicely. I've used it. One of the things that Carol and I have looked at is comparing QGIS, comparing just 3 words off your phone, grid references from an OS app map off your phone, Google grid references, and then actually taking out a proper GPS. Just 3 words: OS grid references from their app, Google grid references are all equally accurate, but they can be more accurate than a proper, more inaccurate than a proper GIS, proper GPS, Garmin type handheld thing. The one thing to be aware of with both getting grid references off your phone and even proper GPSs is waiting long enough for it to acquire as many satellites as possible. I think that your phone won't acquire as many satellites as a proper GPS will. You can spend hours making really pretty pictures, and so that's worth just one. That's to remind me we're nearly at the end now. What I would like to add in is I've been talking this week with Michael Miller from the OB and Wigston Fieldworkers, who is really got into GIS by the sounds of it, and he's been collaborating with Helen Wells to link his QGIS data with the historic environment record. And I think this is going to be, somebody needs to turn their microphone down. And hopefully it's something that we will be able to include. I think it's probably really would be a big move forward. So that's all, folks. If you've got any questions, I'll take them now. If you don't want to say anything over the over this meeting, you can always email me at the address below. And as I say, we will hopefully we'll be doing some practical sessions. But I'm also equally, if you want to start downloading stuff, downloading QGIS and have some issues, I can probably always do a Zoom with individuals if it helps. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you very much, Simon. That was a really good introduction to newbies who have never really touched GIS or haven't done it for a long time, like myself. Well, what I'd like now is a discussion, if people would like to contribute, how we might move forward, you know, anything that you would like to add at this point. So, yeah, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks for that, Simon. That was really interesting to sort of see how you're using QGIS for doing all the field surveys, and particularly like the use of the LiDAR. Not only because it looks good, but also it was just down the road from where I used to live in Hobie. So the ridge and furrows by the fields up near Rotherby and Brooksby were something I know well from as a kid. Just two sort of questions following on from that, really. Have you looked into using QField for doing the field survey actually on your phone or on tablet? And have you, for any of the sites in the East Midlands, have you looked at using UAVs for getting drone survey LiDAR data at much higher resolution than you can from the commercial EA or commercial data?
Okay, 2 questions there. The answer is to both is no, but just a slight extension is first of all, very much the data recording has been done by different fieldworking groups, and that both the ones I've worked with haven't used anything like that in the field. It's an interesting idea. It's something that I think individual groups we need to be persuaded to do. What's tended to happen is that people like Paul and Richard have just sent me their information, and then I've put it together for them. Certainly, I think UAVs are likely to be a way forward in the future. One thing I would say, from working with people who use UAVs in my professional life, is that you really need to know what you're doing with UAVs, and although you don't necessarily need a license now. If you're not careful, particularly in this part of the world, the guys over at East Midlands Airport are going to pretty miffed with you, and you might see somebody knocking on your door if you haven't dotted all the I's and crossed the T's on using them.
Yeah, I mean, I'll second that. If anybody is using drones for even just for domestic purposes, then you need to follow the civil aviation guidance. And if they're being used for commercial purposes, then you actually need a proper, in effect, a pilot's license to be able to cover the use of it for commercial purposes.
But it's certainly, I mean, I think I could see not necessarily using them for large scale mapping, but even just being able to take some decent aerial pictures of a field you're walking in advance of walking it. Yeah, and you should be able to geo-register those pictures from it. I've not come across one that actually does its own LiDAR yet. Maybe there are some commercial ones that do, but
we have done a survey for a rewilding project up near Loch Lomond, and we used drones with LiDAR for that.
Oh, right.
And we were actually being able to get down to resolutions of 2.5 centimeters, and it was fantastic. With that hillshade, you're actually able to pick up the individual tractor tracks going through the fields.
Wow. No, I mean, yeah. This is the future. I've just cracked the curtain a bit.
Mike Miller here. Could I just say one or two things?
Yes, go on, Mike. Yep.
Right. One on the use of QField. I've been using the alternative to that. Actually, would quite be interested if anybody has actually used QField. Maybe Jonathan has. But I've been using input to map footpaths for the Unrecorded Ways project, and then input that via the merged cloud system into QGIS. And you can then use the points that you record on your mobile phone to actually sort of track paths and create your own shapefiles, which actually go on top of that. And you can match those up with maps and so on. We're doing quite a lot on permissive paths in my local parish, Hoglescote and Donington, for that during the during the little interregnum that we've had recently. I think the second thing is as well, you showed that slide of the from the Obie and Wigston data. Some of that was done from Mike Bruce has done a very good system, which the Obie and Wigston group have been using for actually recording. And Helen Wells was able to make some shape files using polygons and spot points and so on from that data, which I then used to actually put that in. And that slide was from a presentation to the Obie and Wigston group to show what we'd actually done as a group from field walking. So hopefully that'll get all picked up a little bit later.
Can I just mention that the issues with QField and input are really interesting, in that QField, as it stands at the moment, is only available on Android devices, but the input system is available for iOS, Apple devices. And I've used both for sort of contaminated land survey walkovers. So yeah, I'm glad you're able to use it, Michael. It sort of seems to be a good system.
Excellent. One thing I should have said about input, it does like the 3 words thing, and you can get the satellite down to sort of 3 meter areas, but if you adjust the settings, you can actually get it down to 1 meter. So if you're actually doing field walking, for example, and going up, you could map every a spot for every find that you've got as you walk up a field. You can even take a photograph with it. So you can photograph either the find in the ground before you pick it up, or the location if you find something really interesting. And when you load that to Merging, you upload the photographs automatically and everything, and it's got a facility on it for making notes. So it will do the GPS, you can put the date in, the time that you actually found something, plus a photograph. So that's actually been quite useful. As I say, I haven't used it for field walking yet, but I have used it for mapping paths.
I can see if you're taking a photograph of every find and you're on a Roman site, it could take you an awful long time to get across the field. But yeah, useful stuff. Anybody else like to comment at this point?
I was gonna sort of have a couple of thoughts. There was a couple of things coming in from the comments box. There was a bit of a discussion about the OB and Wigston's Excel files, and the ones that they are all downloadable from the Fieldworkers website under resources fieldwork guides, if anyone wants to look at them. The issue, as Simon was talking about, is translating that data into a system that the QGIS will, or any GIS will accept, which is slightly different. But if you just want a simple way of, and really effective way of plotting the fields, those Excel sheets really work. And we'll be adding more stuff, I'm sure, as new things are created into that thing. So keep an eye on the Fieldwork guides section on our website. I think there's two issues with GIS and field walking. One is the way the data is collected and finding. So you've got the traditional way of collecting the data that we are all used to, which then may have several steps that are involved to then make it translatable into something that you can then process digitally. And there's also then, so there's the one angle is perhaps starting to think about new ways of recording the fieldwork data in the field, which is things like you could go as far as going with apps that actually collect the data for you. But it's also potentially, it's just this case of getting point data that you can instantly input, which is creating grid references in the field effectively. If you can link each of your stints and traverses with a grid reference in the field, you've instantly got the data you can input into the QGIS very quickly. The second one is that then obviously there is a backlog of information that could be translated into data that could be inputted into GIS. And the advantage here is if you can start putting in everything you've done in the past into GIS, you've got a huge database of all your work. And also that then can be transferred to the historic environment record very easily and get that out there for everybody to use in the future. And then, of course, there is the learning of the GIS and the other things that GIS can give you in terms of analysing your fieldwork data, which Simon has touched on. Things like using LiDAR and correlate, so that you can start looking for patterns that you wouldn't otherwise see in terms of geographic or archaeological. You can start requesting the historic environment record and instantly overlaying it with your fieldwork data as well. So this is a very versatile system. If people are feeling confident enough to learn it, you can actually extract a lot more for your research projects by using this. And I mean, you can go even further than that. GIS is incredibly versatile in terms of creating new information. Viewshed analysis, so you can start, so if you've identified, say, let's say you found a Roman site on top of a hill or tucked down in a valley, or you've identified a potential Bronze Age barrow, you could actually start using GIS to look at how visible it is in the landscape or was in the landscape. You can start doing all sorts of hypothetical analysis with it as well as you become more confident with it. So it is something really worth exploring. I think it's really underutilized in fieldwork groups who are collecting the bulk of the landscape data effectively in the country. We use it commercially. I mean, we use ArcGIS like Simon does professionally. But yeah, QGIS is an absolutely good alternative, especially considering it's free, which is the biggie. ArcGIS is definitely very expensive.
Can I just follow up on that, Matthew?
Yeah.
Just one of the things you're saying about if you like, the historical data that the fieldwork groups already have. I think that's something that particularly Paul Dickinson from the Melton Group and I have talked about, and and I'm trying to, should we say, digitize some of his old records. Is that what would be really helpful amongst the field workers would be, we don't have to have everybody being able to use QGIS. What would be really helpful would be, in the same way, people are prepared to go away and clean finds, if people were prepared to take some of the old paper records, and if they're happy enough using Excel, and put them into an Excel spreadsheet, then somebody like me, or if you like, the QGIS expert for each group, could then much more quickly then take that into the GIS. Is one of the most time-consuming things is inevitably reformatting or transposing data from written records. So I'd actually quite like to see whether we can't get some people from the field workers who are just happy to spend an hour here or an hour there in an evening, transferring data for us into a hopefully, if we can agree, a universal format that it can be quickly taken into the GIS, and then we can get that historical data. I mean, I guess the professional archaeologists amongst quite well, there's so much grey literature out there that doesn't see the light of day these days. Because for most people, if you can't search for it on Google or Google Scholar, people aren't interested in using it. Let's access that historical data.
Yeah, I mean, I was quite encouraged by the fact that the Lutterworth Fieldwork Group have just appointed a records officer to actually sort of take charge of recording their finds. And I think it'd be really useful if every group had somebody with a responsibility for getting stuff into a standard format of data that could be then taken and used, who won't necessarily have GIS skills, but if they do, that's a bonus. I think this is the way forward.
Helen Wells is here. Helen, would you like to join us and sort of perhaps mention what from a HER officer's point of view would be useful?
Hello.
Sorry for putting you on the spot there.
No, that's all right.
I've been following the conversation in the chat box there, so.
Yeah, I'm just trying to avoid the camera by chatting. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm basically of the mind that however I'm given data, I'm not that bothered if it's clear as long as I'm given the data. But yeah, I've had quite a lot from the OB and Wigston group using their spreadsheets, and they're really good. That's been much easier to use. Yeah, if people want to start storing things in QGIS, then they can send me shape files and I can use those. So it could potentially be quite useful.
Because you are now using QGIS yourself for the HER.
I mean, even before that, we could have used the shape files from QGIS, but yeah. We're using it because it's free.
Yeah.
But yeah, it can do a lot of things a lot better than MapInfo could anyway, like georeferencing and things like that. So heat maps, all sorts of fun things.
Yeah, I mean, even professionally now, we do a lot of work with overseas geological surveys and development groups, and people just cannot afford to use ArcGIS or MapInfo or whatever, and so or they use pirated copies, which we as a government organisation we can't condone. So I foresee QGIS taking over the world eventually.
Yeah.
Can I just add again, just to back up those points, that one of the values of any of the GIS software is actually being able to integrate information from lots of different systems. So if you're working with lots of groups or getting information from different sources, the open source data and downloading, QGIS is brilliant at bringing data together from different sources. And in my day job, I run my own GIS consultancy, and I actually swap between QGIS and ArcGIS, ArcPro, all the time. So I have taken the plunge of spending the money on ArcGIS, but I do regularly use QGIS in my day-to-day work. Some of the functions it does is a lot better anyway, and it's just picking the one that you know how to use best and does the job the quickest. But yeah, as a data integration tool, pulling data together from all sorts of sources and organisation, it's great.
Yeah, I think it's another thing to say is that don't think the sorts of information that I've shown today are the limit. If you have some sort of information that has any sort of geographical component, i.e., which it does because it comes from a particular place, then there will be a way of getting that into that information into a GIS. So if you've got some sources of information and you don't know how to do it, there will be somebody who could tell you a way of getting that information into GIS.
Right. Can I suggest, Simon, that your Excel sheet could usefully go on the website under the resources there,
no,
for people to be able to easily get hold of that format, try it out, see if anybody's got any improvements, and we can actually move it on forward.
Yeah. Who should
you email it to me, Simon?
Okay.
I'll put it up. So.
Yeah. What I'll send you, Matt, is a partially filled one, is an empty one and a partially filled one, so people see what they're supposed to put in the boxes.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. We'll add it into the list of stuff under his Fieldwork Guide 1, if I remember rightly, which is the field walking one, and it'll be there with the Obi and Wigston stuff as well.
Yeah.
So.
And I won't be offended if people tell me that there's a better way of doing it.
Well,
I think at this point, this is what we need to find out, isn't it? So,
yes. Straw man.
Yeah. Is there anybody else who'd like to make any general comments before we actually move on to what we do next? No. We clearly have a few people here who are much better versed in GIS than the rest of us. And is it useful for them to get together, or is the next thing to actually have a workshop where we can actually sit with laptops and sort of work through how to get stuff on? I mean, I'm interested in what people think might be the next step. No, okay.
Both simultaneously, Peter. Is right. I think there's two different aspects. It'd be useful to get together those people who have GIS experience to try and forge a generic way forward for Leicester Fieldworkers, but also we want to bring some people in at the grassroots. But actually, the first group will hopefully be the trainers for the second.
Yeah, absolutely. So can I suggest then, if the people with the skills, which is going to be a relatively small proportion of the people at this meeting, because we had 40 at one point on it. It slightly dropped a few as we've gone along. But if they could email into the info@Leicestershire Fieldworkers email, our generic email, we will then arrange a meeting either online or in person, as seems best, for that group to talk to one another. And then meanwhile, we will get a date for a workshop. I think we are looking probably at the first one of these, and I think we'll probably try and do several across the county, probably at Melton Carnegie Museum. That's what you were suggesting, Simon, and I think that makes sense.
Paul's quite happy to liaise with the people in the museum. He said that the museum are really, the current climate are really keen to make full use, for people to make full use of their facilities.
Well, as Richard Knox now runs it, I think we should probably find a welcome there. Would anyone like to add anything else at this point? I don't know if people have been looking at the chat box as we've gone on, but there's
Can I just make a comment about, sorry, I was late to the meeting, it's Bob Gale here. Just wanted to say that obviously we've got my Bruce in our group, who's done a huge amount in order to set up our system. And obviously, and I know Mike said right from the start that this was pioneering stuff, and that, you know, obviously something else is going to come along that will improve it or whatever. I suppose the question for me is, I mean, we've done some not far off 100 fields, I think, in the last few years. How much of that is going to have to be adapted, completely redone in order to fit the new system? Or does it need to be redone to hit the new system?
good question, Bob.
I don't think, I mean, it probably would to get into the GIS, but it wouldn't be as big a task as starting from scratch.
It's all on spreadsheets, isn't it? So, I mean, it would be a matter of reformatting the spreadsheets, I think. So most of the work has been done, I would think. But
if you've got 100 sheets that are in exactly the same format, then we can find a way of automating, taking that.
And
into
because
the
they're
new
already
format.
they're already on the HER. They've already been submitted.
Oh right. Well then, in that case, they're all.
Then they've already been converted, and you're fine. So
yeah.
Right. Okay.
So sounds like we need to talk to Helen about that.
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah. I'm happy to be involved if anyone wants me to be.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think you need to be involved, Helen. So,
yeah. Well, it's if people are planning on sending me the data, it's always nice to know what the plans are for dealing with it.
If they're not planning to send you the data, then there's something wrong, because that is why they're doing it.
I think the key here is getting you more data, and effectively, isn't it? It's that's the end goal here, is to enhance the HER as much as anything. So.
Right. Is there anything else anyone would like to add, or is there anything you'd like to finish up with, Simon? Sort of sum up where we are.
Just pleased to see there were so many people here today. Hopefully, not too many were bored out of their mind by it. And I think, this is us moving forward. I think there's a groundswell of interest, so we just need to surf that swell now.
Right. Well, if there aren't any other comments, I don't want to cut off anybody who's been thinking. Can I thank Simon very much? Can I thank everybody who has contributed to the discussion as we've gone along, because I think it's been extremely useful. And I think that we are starting to see a way forward now. And what we need to do, I think, is to make sure we, each of the groups around the county moves forward, in step, so that we get a county-wide system, and maybe an East Midlands-wide system, as I know that we have colleagues from other counties here, to make it much easier to compare results, around the county and around the region. So thank you very much, Simon, and thank you very much, everybody, for joining in. And I look forward to the next steps. So thank you.